The night was quiet until Sergeant William Hayes heard the sound that froze every man in his squad. It was not gunfire. It was not footsteps. It was the clatter of a helmet, American, not German. In that moment, under a pale moon and drifting smoke, he realized the enemy across the field was wearing the same steel as his own men. What followed would change everything they thought they knew about survival. Before we start, hit that like button and tell us where you're watching from. Your support keeps these incredible WWII stories alive. The night air hung thick with fog and the smell of damp earth. Sergeant William Hayes moved through the shattered remains of a French orchard, his boots sinking into the mud where tanks had passed only hours before. The men behind him stayed silent, their breath visible in the cold. Somewhere beyond the smoke, German lines waited. The only sound was the soft rustle of gear and the faint hum of distant artillery. War had taught them to fear silence more than gunfire. Silence meant something was watching. Hayes stopped near a burned-out Sherman, its turret blown open like a tin can. He pressed a gloved hand against the steel, still warm from the fire. War felt closer when you could touch it. He looked down at the ground and saw something odd lying in the mud. It was an American helmet, but not one of theirs. The paint was scratched, the shape slightly different. It looked almost copied. He turned it over, brushing off soot, and noticed the inside carried German writing. The realization made his stomach tighten. Somewhere out there, Germans were wearing American helmets. At first, it made no sense. Why would the enemy use their gear? Hayes remembered what the intelligence officer said weeks earlier. The Germans were scavenging everything they could find. Steel was steel, and by late 1944, even the Wehrmacht was running out of it. Some said they used captured American helmets because they offered better protection from shrapnel. Others believed it was psychological. Blend in, confuse the enemy, survive the chaos. But Hayes knew there was something deeper. War stripped men of sides and symbols until survival became the only allegiance left. He crouched and motioned Corporal Dawson forward. The young man had joined the unit after Normandy, still too clean, too hopeful. Hayes whispered, "If you see a helmet like this, do not trust it." Dawson nodded, though the fear in his eyes betrayed him. They advanced through the fog, rifles ready. Ahead, through drifting smoke, shapes moved. For a moment, Hayes thought they were Americans. Same stance, same helmets glinting in the moonlight. But then a shadow lifted a weapon with a shorter barrel. Not an M1, a German MP-40. The orchard exploded in chaos. Muzzle flashes tore the dark apart. Men shouted in confusion, friends firing on what looked like their own. The helmets made it impossible to tell who was who. Hayes dove behind a tree, bullets snapping past. He could hear Dawson screaming for cover, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of gunfire. The deception had worked. The Germans were close, too close, using stolen American helmets to move unseen. Hayes forced himself to breathe, counting seconds between the bursts. He peeked out, spotted one of the disguised soldiers, and aimed carefully. The man fell without a sound. Hayes crawled forward, the ground trembling under distant tanks. He could not shake the thought. If the enemy was wearing American helmets, what would come next? How many more tricks did they have left before every line between friend and foe disappeared completely? He looked again at the steel helmet lying beside him, its dull surface reflecting the fire's glow. In this war, identity could vanish in seconds. The helmet no longer meant allegiance. It meant only one thing: someone had wanted to live long enough to see the next dawn. Dawn came slowly, a pale light creeping through the shattered trees as mist rolled across the fields. The gunfire had stopped hours ago, leaving behind a silence that felt unnatural, too heavy for the living. Sergeant Hayes stood among the ruins of the orchard, staring at what was left of his squad. 4 men gone, 2 wounded. The others silent, eyes fixed on the fog as if expecting it to move again. The helmets scattered across the mud told their own story, some American, some German, and some so mixed, it was impossible to tell which belonged to which. Hayes knelt beside one of the fallen and lifted a helmet from the ground. It was the same design he had seen before, an American M1, but the paint beneath the grime revealed faint traces of gray. It had once been German, repainted and worn by someone desperate. He turned it in his hands, trying to understand the madness. War was no longer fought between uniforms. It had become something primal, an endless fight for inches of ground and seconds of life. A radio crackled from the tank husk nearby, breaking the quiet. Hayes crossed the field and lifted the receiver. The static hissed before a voice cut through, tired and uncertain. "Bravo, Company. Report status." He pressed the button, his voice low. "This is Sergeant Hayes. We held the orchard, but we were hit by enemy using captured gear. We could not tell who was who." A pause. Then the reply came, slower this time. "Copy that, Sergeant. Similar reports from the valley. Be advised, some German units are disguising as Americans. Orders are to verify targets before engaging." Hayes lowered the radio, his hand trembling slightly. "Verify targets." As if there was time for that in the fog under fire, when men had seconds to decide life or death. The war was shifting into something crueler. Every trick, every deception was another weapon. He turned to his men, most of them silent, exhaustion etched into their faces. "Check every helmet. If it looks fresh, scrape it. If it is gray underneath, it is not ours." They nodded, too tired to speak. The squad began to move again, pushing east toward a small village marked on their map. Smoke rose in the distance, twisting upward in thin, ghostly trails. As they walked, Hayes noticed the strange stillness of the battlefield. Abandoned rifles, scattered rations, broken radios, all signs of men who had fled in a hurry. The Germans were pulling back, but not retreating. They were shifting, adapting, turning the ruins of the countryside into traps. Near a cratered road, they found another body. This one wore an American jacket, but German boots. The man's helmet was gone, his face hidden beneath mud. Private Dawson stared at the corpse for a long moment before asking quietly, "Do you think he was one of them?" Hayes did not answer. He did not know anymore. Maybe the man had been German. Maybe he had been American once and switched sides to survive. Maybe the war had erased all meaning from the question. By midday, they reached the outskirts of the village. The church bell tower stood half-collapsed, its bell hanging at an angle like a broken jaw. A burned-out jeep lay on its side in the square. Hayes signaled his men to spread out, eyes scanning every doorway. Somewhere in the ruins, a sniper could be waiting. Then faintly came the sound of metal striking stone. A helmet again. He froze. The men took cover. The echo came once more, closer this time. Hayes raised his rifle and whispered, "Hold your fire. Identify before you shoot." The fog shifted, and out of it came a figure wearing an American coat and helmet, hands raised. For a moment, relief washed through him, until he saw the weapon slung across the man's shoulder. A German rifle. Hayes felt the weight of the moment press down like gravity. In this war, even the familiar could be fatal. The figure stepped closer, his breath visible, his voice trembling. "Do not shoot," he said in accented English. "I am not who you think I am." The man stood still in the drifting fog, his hands raised higher as the wind tugged at his coat. The squad surrounded him in a loose half-circle, rifles trained, eyes sharp but uncertain. Sergeant Hayes stepped forward, his boots crunching over shattered glass and spent shells. He stopped 5 feet away and looked the man over. The uniform was real, American issue, worn and dirt-stained, but the rifle was unmistakably German. The man's face was young, maybe no older than 20, pale from fear and exhaustion. His helmet bore the faint curve of an M1, but its liner was wrong, cut from a different shape. Hayes could see the deception in every detail, yet also something else. Desperation. "Drop the weapon," Hayes said quietly. The man hesitated, then let the rifle fall into the mud. He spoke again, his English broken but clear enough. "I took it from the field. I did not want to die. Please do not shoot." The men exchanged glances. Private Dawson shifted uneasily, his finger trembling near the trigger. Hayes lowered his weapon slightly. "You are German," he said, more as a statement than a question. The man nodded. "Yes, or maybe not anymore. I do not know what that means now." His voice cracked near the end, a mix of shame and exhaustion that made the air feel heavier. Hayes motioned for Dawson to search him. The boy moved forward cautiously, checking for hidden weapons. There was nothing. Just a torn photo of a woman and a child folded so many times the faces had faded. Hayes looked at it for a moment, then handed it back. "Where did you get the uniform?" he asked. The man answered, "From your dad. Near the river. We were told it might keep us alive if we wore it. His eyes darted around the ruined square. It worked once. The shells stopped falling. Your planes would not fire on Americans, he paused, his voice lowering. But then our own shot at us. No one knew who anyone was anymore. The truth of it settled like a shadow over the squad. The war had reached a point where even survival was a lie. Hayes could feel the unease in his men. They wanted clear enemies, not ghosts and stolen coats. "What is your name, Horeb?" he asked. "Lucas," the man replied softly. "Lucas Meyer, Panzer Grenadier, or I was. Now, just Lucas." He looked toward the east, where the faint sound of artillery echoed like distant thunder. "My unit is gone. Maybe my country, too." Hayes studied him for a long moment. He thought of the men they had lost, of helmets scattered across the orchard, and of the strange, twisted mirror the war had become. Here was an enemy soldier wearing an American uniform, terrified and human. Killing him would mean nothing now. "You are coming with us," Hayes said. "You try anything, you die." "Understood?" Lucas nodded. His relief was quiet, almost invisible. They moved through the ruins together, the fog swallowing their shapes. The village was silent, except for the creak of broken shutters and the distant moan of wind through the bell tower. Every corner held the possibility of another ambush, another deception. Hayes kept his rifle ready, but his thoughts were elsewhere. How many more soldiers like Lucas were out there, men who had stopped fighting for flags and started fighting for breath? As they neared the church, a flash of movement caught Hayes's eye. He raised a fist, signaling the squad to halt. From a doorway, two figures stepped out, helmets low, weapons ready. The markings were American, but something about the way they moved felt wrong. Hayes whispered, "Positions!" The squad scattered for cover. The two figures advanced slowly, one calling out, "Friendly! Do not shoot!" Hayes squinted through the haze. The voice was smooth, practiced, but off by a note, like a word learned from a book, not born from a heart. Lucas whispered, "They are not yours." The next second erupted into fire. Muzzle flashes cut through the fog, bullets shattering the air. Hayes dropped behind a wall, returning fire as the squad scrambled to hold position. Smoke filled the square again, thick and choking. The war of shadows had returned, and this time it would not end with dawn. The gunfire rolled through the village like thunder trapped in stone. Hayes pressed his shoulder against the cold wall, waiting for a break between bursts. Dust rained from the ceiling with every shot that struck the brick. The air smelled of burned powder and wet plaster. He could hear Dawson yelling something from across the square, but the words were lost under the crack of rifles. Lucas crouched beside him, clutching the American helmet tight against his chest, like it might still save him. His eyes darted toward the doorway, fear glimmering beneath layers of dirt and sweat. Hayes signaled to cover the left flank. The men shifted positions, boots scraping over debris, breath sharp and quick. The fog outside mixed with the smoke from their rifles, wrapping the village in a ghostly haze that turned every shadow into an enemy. Hayes risked a glance around the corner. Two of the impostors were down, one still moving. Their helmets gleamed faintly in the broken light, identical to his own men's. The deception was flawless. A single wrong move, and they would fire on each other. He cursed quietly, forcing himself to think. He turned to Lucas. "You said they were not ours. How could you tell?" Lucas hesitated, then pointed to the men's belts. "Your soldiers fasten from the left, ours from the right. Little things. You learn them when you have to." Hayes nodded, absorbing the detail. Every inch of knowledge mattered now. "Good, you stay behind me. If this goes wrong, you find cover and stay down." Lucas nodded, still gripping the helmet like a lifeline. The fight stretched on, minutes feeling like hours. Each exchange of fire left another wall cracked, another body still. The squad's ammunition was running low. Hayes could hear the metallic clack of empty magazines being replaced too often. The radio had gone silent again, its antenna bent and useless. They were alone in this ghost town, cut off from command, surrounded by men who looked like them and shot like them. The line between truth and imitation had vanished completely. Then, from somewhere deeper in the village, came the slow growl of an engine. It was not one of theirs. The ground trembled slightly beneath their boots. Hayes felt the vibration crawl up his legs and into his chest. "Tank," he muttered, though the word barely reached the others. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by the metallic clatter of tracks on cobblestone. Through the mist emerged a dark shape, its barrel sweeping side to side like a searching eye. Hayes recognized the silhouette instantly, a German Panzer, but it carried markings painted to resemble American stars. The realization hit like a punch. They had taken the deception further than anyone expected. A German tank disguised as American would cause chaos in the entire sector. Hayes' mind raced. He motioned his men toward the church, their only solid cover left. "Move inside." They sprinted across the square, bullets whistling past as the Panzer opened fire. The first shell struck the ground just behind them, lifting dirt and flame into the air. Hayes felt himself thrown forward, ears ringing, lungs burning. He crawled toward the steps, dragging Dawson by the collar. Inside the church, the light was dim and filled with dust. Stained glass shattered long ago, leaving colored fragments scattered across the floor. The men regrouped near the altar, breathing hard, faces streaked with grime. Lucas stood near the doorway, looking out into the smoke. "They will come," he whispered. "They always come after the fire." Hayes looked around the ruined chapel and saw the faces of men too tired to be afraid. He realized then that this fight was no longer about winning. It was about not disappearing into the fog like the others had. He reached for his canteen, his hand trembling from exhaustion. Outside, the Panzer's engine rumbled closer, echoing through the narrow streets like a heartbeat of steel. The enemy was adapting faster than they could comprehend. Hayes looked at Lucas and said, "If they want to wear our helmets, let them. But today, they will learn what it means to fight the men who wore them first." Lucas met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. The sound of treads drew nearer. The church wall shook again. And then, as the sunlight broke through the fog for the first time that day, Hayes raised his rifle and prepared for the storm that was coming. The ground quivered as the Panzer crawled closer, its engine echoing off the stone walls of the ruined village. Each rotation of its tracks ground cobblestones into dust. Inside the church, every man waited in stillness, hearts pounding, the weight of silence pressing against their ears. Hayes crouched near the doorway, watching the shadow of the tank stretch across the fog. The iron beast moved with slow, deliberate confidence. Its barrel turned toward the church, cutting through the haze like a finger pointing toward judgment. The sound of the turret's gears was low and metallic, almost human in rhythm. Hayes whispered to Lucas, "You said they took our helmets. Do they also take our fear?" Lucas shook his head, his voice trembling. "No, Sergeant, only your steel. Fear is still theirs." The words hung in the air for a moment, strange comfort in a dying place. Hayes turned to his men. They were down to their last magazines, some with only a handful of rounds left. Dawson's hands shook as he checked his rifle again, his face pale beneath the grime. Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hold until you see the barrel flash, nothing before." Dawson nodded without speaking. The Panzer stopped in the center of the square. For a moment, everything went quiet except for the ticking of its engine. Then the barrel fired. The shell hit the church facade with a roar that shook the earth. The wall crumbled inward, showering the men with debris. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking, mixing with the smell of burning stone. Hayes coughed, hard, eyes watering, then shouted, "Positions!" The squad returned fire, their bullets sparking against the tank's armor, useless but defiant. The Panzer's machine gun swept the windows, tearing through the wooden frames. Hayes pulled Lucas down behind the altar. "There is no way to kill it head-on," he said. Lucas looked toward the rear of the church, where the floor had partially collapsed into a cellar. "The back wall opens to the alley," he said quickly. "The engine of a Panzer is thin armor. You can hit it there." Hayes looked at him, then at the terrified faces of his men. There was no time to argue. "Dawson, cover fire. I am taking Lucas through the alley." They slipped into the cellar, moving through dust and fallen beams. The ground vibrated with each shot above. Hayes could feel it in his chest like a second heartbeat. The cellar opened into a narrow alley choked with rubble. The tank's silhouette loomed through the smoke ahead. Hayes and Lucas crawled closer, the heat from the Panzer's exhaust washing over them. Lucas pointed. There! The engine vents glowed faintly under the armored rear. Hayes took aim with his last grenade, pulled the pin and whispered, "For every man who never came home," he threw it. The explosion tore through the morning stillness, the force slamming him back into the wall. The tank lurched, smoke pouring from its rear, as flames spread along its hull. For a moment it seemed to hesitate, then stopped moving entirely. The turret froze, the engine groaned, and then silence returned, broken only by the slow crackle of fire. Hayes staggered to his feet, ears ringing. Lucas stood beside him, staring at the burning Panzer, the false American stars melting into blackened steel. Hayes exhaled, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Now they will know the difference." They walked back toward the church. The square was filled with drifting ash and falling snow, blending together until the world looked colorless. His men emerged one by one, faces ghostly in the pale light. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The radio crackled again, faint but alive. "Bravo Company, report." Hayes lifted the receiver. "This is Sergeant Hayes. The village is secure. The enemy is gone." There was a long pause before the reply. "Understood. Hold position until further orders." He set the radio down and looked at the burned tank one last time. The enemy had tried to look like them, to move like them, to survive like them, but in the end, the difference was not in helmets or armor. It was in the will to stand when the fog closed in and everything else had vanished. The bell in the broken tower swayed with the wind, ringing once before falling silent again. Hayes turned toward his men and said quietly, "Let us go home."